Good evening all, or good morning, good day, wherever you happen to be at the moment. I think mostly people will be on British or European time, but do feel free to make use of the chat function to say where you are and who you are, where you are, and what you're drinking. And also add in any comments on things I say or things you would like said. And of course, we also have the question and answer function if you want to ask a particular question. What I'm going to talk about today is the 2021 vintage in Burgundy. And I will do it just by going through briefly the growing season. I won't do a sort of day-by-day account of what happened, but more a question of using incidents in the growing season to try to understand how the wines have come out at the end of the day. And then we'll take a look at various winemaking and wine aging options to see what choices people made and what effect they might have on the wines. Then we'll come to how the wines taste like and what might be a good reason to buy them and what might be a less good reason. So and try and put them in place in terms of other vintages. Great. Well, I can see that the chat is going very well. We've got Tromsø there in Norway and New York, Nottingham, etc., Sweden, New Orleans. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And a couple of sad people from Australia saying it's 2 o'clock in the morning, so we're not going to stay with it. And somebody from Basingstoke, my hometown. Lovely. Grand. Well, keep it going. I see some of you are drinking water. I'm actually not drinking anything. We started our dry January yesterday, and we're going to finish it tomorrow. So it's not going to be a very long dry January, but even so, 3 days is probably a good thing to do. Tasting the 2021s. So I spent all of October and November tasting away as busily as I could. So over 200 domains in the Côte d'Or. And earlier in the year, I'd done Chablis and occasionally other parts of Burgundy. And one feature that did come out of it was that the wines were in some ways very easy to taste and in some ways difficult. The thing that was easy was that you would end the week still feeling relatively fresh. I remember being wiped out at the end of every week's tasting of the 19s and 20s. And even by the end of each day, it was pretty tiring. But in 21, the wines were easier to spend time with and didn't leave you tired at the end of it. On the other hand, they were difficult because you needed to pinpoint what was, on the one hand, a cheerful freshness, an attractive character, or possibly on the other hand, something which was a little bit lean and green and raw and would never come together. So to get a really accurate view on any given wine was not all that easy to do. It was probably easier last year with 2020, when either they were powerful, delicious wines, or else they were over the top, too hot, too extracted. So let's start with, my word, I mean, I can see how many people have signed up, and I can see how many different countries are showing. So it's not quite one per country, but it is a really good cross-section. So I thank you for that. Right. So the growing season, well, of course, as we're all now aware, it began with hideous frosts in April, after a very warm week at the end of March, which we've got the vegetation cycle up and running, and then crunch, down it came 6th, 7th and 8th of April. I'm not going to go into the details of how each night and each day, each morning differed, but clearly everybody was affected from Chablis right the way down through into the Beaujolais. The worst affected were the white wines because they tend to start their cycle earlier, and in particular, those in traditionally early spots. Plus, of course, anybody who didn't protect their vines at all was more likely to suffer. The people who suffered least were the red wines in backward spots, areas that are typically always a bit cooler, a bit slower to start, and the handful of possible ways in which people were able to use successful protection. So in terms of protection, you could light the candles or bougie, but they weren't very effective unless you used an awful lot of them, and you lit them very early in the evening. And the other problem with those is that they're ecologically not very friendly, and people are unkeen to continue to use them. Secondly, you could try and protect by water aspersion. If you're up in Chablis, there's a system to do it when you spray water over the vines just as they hit freezing, and it forms a protective shell of ice and doesn't go below freezing. There are some negatives there. A, you're wasting water, and B, let's say in the Fourchaume vineyard in Chablis, which is widely uses water aspersion. What was clear after that was that the growing cycle went ahead earlier, the crops were bigger, and the grapes started ripening earlier, but at the same time, they're also more susceptible to disease, mildew, and more susceptible to rot. So you do have to think about what's going to happen later in the season. The other thing pioneered in Chablis and possibly going to come in the Côte d'Or is to have electric cables which enable you to heat up your vines. But it's quite expensive to put in and massively wasteful of electricity. So that's not great news in the current circumstances either. And then in a totally different direction, various people who believe in phytotherapy, the use of plants to improve the quality of whatever you're growing. Some of those, they treated their vines when they knew it was going to frost with a mix of sarriette in French, savory in English, thyme and oregano before, and then they put on a little spray of valerian and nettles afterwards, and they all seem to say, we think it did good, but to what extent you can actually prove that, I'm not sure. One other person said that they sprayed pectins on the vines just before it frosted, and she thought they had done good as well. What didn't work were covering your vines in tarpaulins, because they just trapped the cold air underneath the tarpaulins and froze even worse, or using wind turbines, which will happen when the frost is only quite a light one and you've got warm air quite close by. And if you churn up the cold air, then the warm air comes in and it's all good news. But when you've just got this massive blanket of polar cold air, then they're not going to do you any good at all. So we may suffer from this again. Global warming is an enemy rather than a friend. We had a very warm October already. I was listening to the Today program on Radio 4 this morning, and they're talking about the hottest ever temperatures in January already, and the possibility of an El Nino year. But if we get very warm temperatures, February and March, then the vegetation cycle will start very early, and there's then still the risk of this massive flood of cold air coming down in, what do they call it? A sort of a freeze bomb effect. They've just called it the one they've had in North America, and we are at risk of those. In terms of the impact on 2021 vintage, the frost, rather than just being a question of reducing your crop, it does have some quality impacts. The least frosted vineyards made the best grapes as well as the most grapes. And it was quite obvious in a number of cellars that you'd be going along and quite liking the wines without being stunned by them. And then you come across one that was considerably more interesting, more classical, and you would be told that that was the vineyard that escaped the frost. So that definitely has an impact. And the frosted vines remained very fragile all through the season. This is a parallel with 2016, when there was a big mildew pressure afterwards. And if you hadn't been frosted, you resisted the mildew. Oidium came next, rot towards the end of the season. Every time with all these problems, if you hadn't been damaged by the frost, you were much more likely to resist without difficulty. And obviously also all the various forms of frost protection, there is often an ecological negative attached to them. Right, well, let's forget those 3 disastrous days in the beginning of April and move instead into the summer months. And I won't trace sort of week by week, day by day, but just to say in the summer months, the things that you had to cope with were mildew, first of all, oidium, various points in the summer, hail, not much, but there was some hail, particularly in Gevrey-Chambertin in June. And there was some hail also in parts of the Mâconnais. There was a little attack of caterpillars called mange-bourgeons, or bud eaters. So that affected some people. I heard about it more in the Côte d'Ivoire, but I don't know scientifically if that is accurate. And then, of course, you had the rot, which set in a little bit in August, but then dried. But once that had happened, it left a little foyer, they would say in French, of rot, which once it rained again from time to time in September, the rot could take hold. Throughout the season, though, it wasn't a consistent picture of rainfall all the time. It felt like it, but actually you'd often have 2 or 3 days of drier weather. And in the Côte d'Or, at any rate, it was reasonably possible to maintain an okay spraying program. So it was possible to fight back against these things. And even people who were just starting out to be organic found mostly that they could continue their programs and they were able to save the crops. It was way more difficult down south, possibly in the Mackinac and certainly in the Beaujolais. I went through in July and I just saw this group of vignerons who were completely worn out, absolutely shattered by the work that they had to do day in, day out, and the fact that it was a lot more difficult there to save your vines from the various disease problems. So it's not looking good then by the time we come through towards the end of August, but the weather did get better in the second part of August, and September wasn't too bad at all. So now we come to harvest time, and people are talking about 2021 being a late harvest. Well, yes, it's late against 2003, 2005, 7, 11, 15, 18, 19, 20, and subsequently 22. But actually, it's very normal to have a mid-September harvest. Shouldn't be a surprise. It shouldn't be difficult. And if you go back to the 90s and before the 90s, you'd actually be pretty thrilled to be picking in the middle of September. In the 1950s, almost every vintage was picked in October. And even since 2000, 2004, 8, and 10 wouldn't have been earlier, and 2013 was, and 16 wasn't earlier, and 13 was definitely later. So you know, it's far from unique, but it's an old normal rather than a current normal. And then when did you pick? And the weird thing, and I've never seen this before, any vintage ever, is that Chablis, Côte d'Ivoire, Côte de Beaune basically all picked at the same time. It was a question of finding the optimum window. So 1 or 2 early birds might have picked 1 or 2 very early vineyards, because there are plenty of people who start their main crop on one day, but they will have sent a small team out to pick maybe some young vines, maybe an area that's suffering a bit from disease, maybe an area which is always typically going to ripen before the rest. And then they will say, but my main starting date was X. So it rained a little bit 14th, 15th, and possibly 16th of September. And then the early birds, without anybody being exaggeratedly early, picked on the 17th and 18th. Lots of people in the Côte de Beaune, lots of people in Chablis, and already a certain number in the Côte d'Ivoire. People were, of course, looking at forecasts, and they could see forecast was for rain. So the 18th was a Friday. By Saturday evening, the weather deteriorated. Sunday 20th, Monday 21st. It did definitely rain quite heavily on the Sunday, though it can, of course, vary from one part to another. You probably took the 22nd to dry off from that. And then there's a big bunch of picking, either for the first time or else people who did a bit on the 17th, 18th, 19th, and then continued on the 23rd. The 23rd through to 26th, you had good weather on the whole. And that is when the vast majority of the crop of the good producers would have been brought in. There was more rain forecast for the following weekend, and indeed the 27th was quite heavy rainfall. And though some people were continuing through to the 30th and even very occasionally into the beginning of October, though that was rare, the bulk of the grapes came in, as I say, in that period, 23rd to 26th. And that to me is probably the sweet spot, with the exception maybe of Chablis, where the grapes were only just ripe around the 17th, 18th, but nonetheless the degrees were quite good, and they were fairly healthy. But if you waited until after that first bit of rain, it did dilute the grapes up in Chablis a bit, and it did start advancing the rot. So it was a trade-off, not an absolute disastrous call, not like 2013, when if you hadn't picked before the really wet weekend of around the 4th of October, then it was a disaster after that. That wasn't the case here, but you probably did better in Chablis fractionally if you could pick just before. So those were the picking dates, and as I say, are very even across the piece. But, and I don't yet have an explanation for this, the red grapes of the Côte de Beaune, which typically would ripen before the Côte de Nuits and typically get picked before, though not in this year, were clearly less ripe than the phenologically ripe than those of the Côte de Nuits. And it may just be to do with them having been set back by having been more heavily frosted, because the frost conditions were worse in the Côte de Beaune. So from here, we come to the conditions of the grapes. And most people said, and on the whole, I see no reason to disbelieve, that the grapes were reasonably healthy, particularly after sorting. And it's standard nowadays for any good producer is going to have a sorting table to deselect what they don't want in reds. But a lot of people wouldn't bother to use that for the whites, but they did mostly in 2021. And if your preoccupation is oidium, which is much more of a white wine disease, you actually have two bites at that particular rotten cherry. One is on the sorting table, and the other is having pressed your grapes, you taste the juice, the must, and you decide as it settles in the tank whether or not you need some additional treatment to clean it up. So you could fine it or filter it at that stage. Though if you filter it, you're probably going to have to use artificial yeasts afterwards. But you can then quite easily remove any taint from oidium if you do that. Equally with the reds, we sort of think you ferment your reds in your vats and then you send the now embryo wine straight to barrel. But actually what you will do is you'll take it out of the first set of tanks and you'll put it to settle in another set of tanks when any solids and impurities will sort of drift down to the bottom, and then you can choose whether you take off the juice relatively clear or whether you allow a certain amount of lees in with the juice into your barrel. And if you didn't take care in 2021, you got some really nasty shocks fairly early on in barrel when suddenly you got some really ugly reductive flavors, even to the extent of rotten eggs, because the lees were not necessarily particularly healthy, because you had to use a lot of treatments in the vines to fight against the various diseases, and you may not have had fully healthy skins. So that was definitely an issue. But you probably, if you're going to get a negative shock, you probably got that shock quite early on. So by the end of the aging period, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But we will come back to that in terms of decisions that people took in how long they were going to age their wines. So what else to say? Sugar levels were pretty much up where they ought to be. Well, I say ought to be. So what do you expect your sugar levels to be? Well, typically, when I was starting out in the early 80s, you would expect a wine to be labeled probably as 12.5 alcohol, but you would know that people had used 1 or 2 degrees of sugar to get it to 12.5, and the cowboys had used rather more than that. Nowadays, we have been through vintages 18, 19, 20, actually less so 22, but 18 through 20, when you were seeing regularly 14s, 14.5s, occasionally 15.5, 16s. And frankly, I don't want to drink Burgundy at those sorts of, not those higher figures at any rate. For whites, 14.5 perhaps, but for reds I will prefer less, and I definitely don't want to get into the 15s for either colour. So we don't quite know what's normal anymore. I think a lot of people would say that they would be really happy with 13 or 13.5. And the grapes were coming in between 11.5 and 12.5 or 13, depending on exactly where you were and when you picked. And then you've got decisions to make about that. So let's take a look at the white grapes first of all. The white grapes have arrived. I'm quite a fan of people crushing their white grapes to break the skins before they press them. But people who like to do that do it on the basis of having healthy grapes. So they would typically, people who would normally crush, a lot of them didn't crush this year. But now you've got your juice, and at this point you can decide, do you want to correct it in any way? Some years you might want to acidify, which at this point you've got very high acidity, albeit mostly malic. And some people might want to chaptalize, i.e. add sugar. Now, it's begun to get a bit of a pejorative concept, chaptalizing, which I think is unfair. I don't think it's a problem unless you do it excessively. And most people I talked to said, yes, we chaptalized, everybody had to chaptalize, but not more than half a degree or possibly 1 degree. The people who said a little amount, maybe they did a bit more. I would only start to get worried if you were going much above 1 degree of added sugar in order to get up to 12.5, 13. I think then it might start to interfere a tiny bit with the balance of the wine. But up to 1 degree, I really don't think it's a problem. And this is true for both colours. If you chaptalize a little bit by adding sugar in fractional amounts, you can actually prolong the length of your fermentation. And people like to do that, especially in the reds. I will mention that again when we talk about the reds. 1 or 2 people didn't chaptalize, and not because they said blithely, it's not a question of them telling me they didn't chaptalize and they made 13 degrees alcohol and wasn't everything wonderful, because you might not believe those people. They said, no, I've got some 11.5s, 11.3, 11.7, and I was happy to leave them like that. And they make wines of beautiful purity. I will cite a couple of names, would have been more, but Fabien Dovissat of domain Jean Dovissat et Fils in Chablis had some things under 12, which he left as they were. And Jean-Marc Rouleau as well. He had one cuvée tasted as low as 11.3 and a red 11.5. And I thought the wines were, particularly that red Montley, absolutely lovely. But they make wines of less body with perhaps less aging potential. So that's a choice to make. It's a brave choice not to chaptalize at all if you're sort of below 12. And I certainly don't mind if people do chaptalize, but I did rather like the wines that hadn't. Sylvain has asked, isn't there a law allowing only to chaptalize a certain degree? It used to be 2. It was brought down to 1 in most places. And you are allowed in a given vintage, a region is allowed to apply for a slightly higher level, and I believe in Chablis they are asked for 1.5. That's off the top of my head, that might not be perfectly accurate. And there was a case of a certain negociant being had up in the courts in 1987 for over-chaptalizing by 3 degrees. And one of their excuses was that, but surely everybody does that. And maybe in the 70s and early 80s, people did, but that's clearly too much. So after that, you send your whites off to, well, they're already in barrel for their fermenting, and away you go. We'll talk about the maturation a bit later on. In the reds, you again, your grapes have arrived. You have, first choice is whether or not you are going to destem them, or whether you're going to put them in whole bunches into your vats, or indeed some blend of the two. So whole bunches have become very popular in these recent warmer years, and particularly if the grapes are healthy. So there was a fairly widespread view of people to use fewer whole bunches in 2021. So people said that the stems are not fully ripe, and the stems may not be completely healthy. If there is a little bit of rot, you can see it on the grapes, but it can also stick a bit to the stems and you don't see it. So a fairly large number of people either used fewer stems or none at all in 21. But not everybody. A few people reduced from 100 or 80% down to 30 or 50. And actually, I found there was quite a sweet spot of the people who used 30% stems in around that area, where you got a little bit of effect, but not too much. You didn't get any negatives. And I found actually quite often those wines seemed to me to have a little bit more succulence and a little bit longer flavor. But remember, I am somebody who rather likes stems in his wines. Guess what? Nobody in Burgundy always goes in the same direction. And we had several people who went the other way and used more stems. Fred Weber, who makes the wines of Bouchard Père Fils, used some more stems. Arnaud Mortet used more stems. And one or two other people also mentioned it because they feel that stems slightly remove acidity. And at this early stage, it looked as though the wines were potentially over acid. Changed later on. And then one person who'd used some stems before, but had never used 100%, went the whole hog, and every one of his cuvées is 100% stems, and that's Nicolas Groffier of Domaine Robert Groffier. So he decided to go counter-current, which was really quite interesting, but and they're fascinating wines. So now at this stage, you have either destemmed or not. There's also another group of people who are moving more and more towards what they call Pédicelle. It's been pioneered by various people over the last 20-odd years. Vougeret at one point, David Dubon at one point, but it's really catching fire at the moment. And that is when you have a vast team of people. It's unbelievably labor-intensive, who, as the bunches come up very slowly across the sorting table, you grab the bunch and you snip off little sections of the grapes. So you're going to be left in your hand with the main stem, which could be a bit green, and the start of the smaller stems. And you've got left now on your sorting table, not necessarily single berries, but little groups of 2 or 3 berries stuck together on one very small stem. So you're keeping your grapes intact, but you're removing the sort of flavor effect of having the main stems with it. This is called Pédicelle, and quite a few people are heading in that direction. Gilbert Falatig a bit, Jean-Pierre Guyon and Von Romanet totally, and a more extreme version, Mr. Garcia in Nuit Saint-Georges is doing what he calls berry by berry, where each individual berry gets snipped off. But it's time consuming, and I would hate to be doing that job at harvest time, I can tell you. Anyway, so that's enough for this vintage then on whole bunch. We now also, for the reds, have the chaptalizing issue, and it's again a very similar thing in reds and whites in terms of decision-making that people took. But a lot of them said, we just put some in towards the end of fermentation to make it go further. A case in point would be Andrew Nielsen, our Australian friend of Le Grappin, who had 2 Premier Crus in 2021, which both came in at 11.5 natural. The Savigny he left as it was, because it fermented normally. The Beaune Boucherotte, he chaptalized simply because otherwise it had completely gone through its fermentation in 5 days, and that wasn't long enough to extract all the flavors that he wanted in the wine. So he just chaptalized small amounts to keep the fermentation going, purely for the benefit of the flavor profile of the wine. And a lot of people would have done versions of that. I just think his case illustrates it beautifully. And now, so you've got your grapes with or without stems and juice in your fermenting vats, and you've got to decide how you're going to extract. Almost everybody said they went for soft extraction, which in any case is part of the zeitgeist these days. And that means you don't do much punching down, maybe a little bit of foot treading, just enough to break up the cap that forms at the top of your vat. You use more pumping over, but do it carefully to make it more of a wash than a brutal splashing. And you intervene as little as possible, and you probably don't have an extremely long vatting time in 2021. A few people went counter that. Justine Clerget, for example, in Vougeot, and Christophe Roumier, in fact. He went back to doing a little bit of punching down, which he stopped doing in recent years. Bouchard, again, did a little bit more. So it's a narrow balance here. You've got a harvest that doesn't especially want to release its goodies, its color and its flavor profile. But if you try and extract too firmly, then you're definitely going to release some rather green tannins and get vegetal flavors in your wine. So if you do nothing at all, you can end up with very light wines, which perhaps you're happy to accept. If you do too much, you definitely end up with things that you don't want to extract. There's probably a perfect balance in which you can try one or two things and do them gently, but make sure you give your the quality of the fruit in your vats the best chance to express itself. So I'm against people who went for very heavy extraction, not that there were many, but I can understand that you might want to do one or two more delicate things, and you've got to keep tasting, you've got to keep checking and making sure you haven't taken it too far. So it's, again, genius is in the infinite capacity of taking pains. One or two people mentioned to me that, as well as adding sugar in some cuvées, they did a little bit of acid correction because they had spotted that the tartaric acid was really quite low. The pHs are surprisingly high for a vintage that tasted really aggressively acid when it first started before the malolactic fermentation. But the thing is, there was a huge amount of malic acid, which we haven't seen in the hot years, and all that changed when it went through the malolactic fermentation. And a few people said, yeah, we did acidify one or two cuvées. I haven't named them in my reports because there is definitely a pejorative feeling against acidifying in Burgundy. But I admire their honesty for saying so. And given that I know quite a lot of other people have done it without saying so, I haven't specified who has. But a number of people, if I did ask the question, said, well, we didn't have to in 21, but we did in 2022. So that will be interesting to take a look at when we come to 22s in a year's time. So both colours tasted, frankly, very ugly. So I'm told, I didn't really taste them much before the malolactic fermentation, which mostly went through a few very early, mostly in the spring, and a few were late, even finishing off this autumn, but most would have been done by the middle of the summer. And then the wines started their real élevage, maturation, and fortunately began to taste a great deal nicer than they had earlier on. There's a question that just appeared there about reverse osmosis, something which was certainly being done a lot in Bordeaux. A few people experimented with it in Burgundy. Mostly they've stopped doing it, partly because they haven't needed to in the hot, dry years. There's one family which own a couple of machines like that. I don't know the one that Sylvain has cited in a question to hosts and panelists. I haven't tasted his wines yet, so I don't know. But I think the view is nowadays that probably reverse osmosis, other forms of concentration machines, are really not necessary anymore. On we go, which I had a glass of wine with me now, but I'm going to be strict for my 3 days. So your wines have now fermented, and it's the whites will have done that for most people at any rate in barrel. Less so in Chablis, where you often ferment in stainless steel and then take to barrel afterwards. But in general, the whites fermented in barrel, and the reds you put into barrel after your fermentation is over, and you've got to decide what to do in terms of new wood. Well, you've got a problem. The problem is that you have your barrel cellar, and you've got a huge number of barrels of the previous year and quite a few years before, and you haven't got any wine to put into them. So how are you going to get around this? the first thing you might do is cancel all your order, if you've placed it so far, of new barrels 2021, simply so you can use your existing stock. You may also feel that the relatively fragile nature, which is what you think of 2021 early on, at any rate, isn't going to suit new wood. So you may not want it for that reason too. But in particular, because you've got to find a way of using up your barrels that you have in your cellar. A few people in white, where these yields were exceptionally low, tried to go out and buy Chardonnay from elsewhere. A lot of people up in Chablis did that after they'd been badly hit in 2016, but it was enormously more difficult to be able to buy Chardonnay from Mâconnais. It wasn't possible, and even the south of France was a bit difficult. A few people did buy cuvées, which enabled them to fill up their barrels with this additional wine, which they then bottled early, and most of them already sold it, and it's probably been drunk. And one or two of them might continue making that cuvée in the future, rather than it being a one-shot with their suppliers, and others will just have done it for 21. In the reds, on the whole, the yields were rarely so low that you had desperately to go out and find something else to fill the barrels with. But you might nonetheless not choose to buy a lot of new wood. And you would put your little baby wines, if you had a sort of Bourgogne Pasturand that wasn't necessarily always an oak, or a Bourgogne Aligoté that wasn't an oak. In 2021, those sorts of wines did get the oak treatment, though not new wood. A couple of people said to me for reds they used more new wood, even quite a lot more, because it being a lighter and more fragile vintage, they wanted the oak to supply a support that wasn't naturally there in the wine. I'd be pretty wary about doing that. I think that comes into the cosmetic field, and you definitely risk adding a form of structure to which the fruit can't stand up. And I will repeat the words, I've mentioned them before, of my barrel-broken friend Mel Knox, who says there's no such thing as an over-oaked wine, there's merely underwined barrels. There weren't many people who took that route, but a couple did, and you will see in all my notes. So we now come to the last thing about the maturation is how long to do it for. Because the acidity has stayed quite high and a bit spiky in the whites, most people have been happy to do the full maturation for their white wines, except if they have very small cuvées. If you've just got a couple of barrels where you would normally have had 6 or 8, you maybe haven't got a tank to rack the wine from your barrels into, except for something which uses one of those sort of floating lids, but they're not quite as airtight as you would want for long-term aging. So a number of people who've got some cuvées of only 1 or 2 barrels have decided to bottle those early and by hand direct from the barrel, rather than risk them suffering during a second winter in tank. Otherwise, people are saying we're going to keep our whites in tank for as long as we normally do, often through to the second spring. In reds, it's a different story. The vast majority of people have said, we're going to bottle early. I mean, not ludicrously early. It's not as if instead of a second winter, they've already bottled them in October, November. But a lot of people were bringing forward by 2 or 3 months because they felt the wines were a little bit fragile. Also, if you bring forward by a couple of months, so instead of bottling in January, you're bottling in November, you can actually then use those barrels again rather than leaving them empty, but you can pour your 22s, a much bigger crop, into those barrels. So you're getting a sort of sensible use of your barrels out of it as well. So as ever, there are several reasons behind any choice. So most people are bottling their reds a little bit early, and that's probably truer in the Côte de Beaune than in the Côte de Nuits, but it's fairly true throughout. Right, so now we've got to a position in which a lot of whites will have been bottled by the end of this year. Some of the reds will have been bottled by the end of the year, and others coming up soon. And all the merchants in London next week may be showing the wines with a few producers coming over to help them. A lot of you I know, I recognize a number of the names on the list of attendees. and I know a number of you will be there at various tastings. So what do we think of the wines? What's the style? What are the comparisons? And I'm going to start with what the growers think. And I got some wonderfully different views. Some of them, and particularly early on, maybe before they had got used to having people come around and they thought, oh dear, we better do a bit of marketing. Some of them said, I really hate this vintage. But these were typically the sort of people who themselves, the owner-operators, spend all their time in the summer out in the vines rather than just having a team to do it for them. And it must have been so stressful managing it. I really take my hat off to them for how well people did react, what work they put in. I saw how exhausted they were, I saw how low the morale was, but they really kept fighting and to good effect. So I discount some of that hate the vintage, but I think they were just letting off steam. A lot of people, and I've used this word several times, but a lot of people did remark on the fact that the wines were fragile. And I think that's true. I don't think it's necessarily dangerous, but I think there will be only a few wines which will make really old bones. Now that may not matter. The older you are, then perhaps the less you want a vintage, which is going to be capable of keeping for a long, long time. Everybody remarked how much better the wines were since the malolactic fermentation took place. And equally, I found, as I tasted through October, November into December, I found that I was getting a better impression of the vintage. Now, it may be because I was up in more in the Côte de Nuits, where I think the wines are better later on. It may be because the wines genuinely got better as every week went by, or it may be because my own palate became more attuned and I saw the nicer side of the vintage. So it's something of everything. A lot of producers described the wines as classic, which I resist because it was a very unclassic growing season. And they said, yes, but what we mean by classic is that it goes back to how wines used to be and that they're not too deep in color and that they're fragrant and they're not too high in alcohol and so on and so forth. And there is an argument for that. I think the successful wines could be described in that way, and there are plenty of those. So that's fine. And a few people said, I really love this vintage. This is great. This is the wine I really want to make. And I'm afraid more often than not, I put that down to an excess of zealous marketing rather than genuinely thinking these are the best wines they've ever made. I think perhaps it was also a reaction to the wines having got so much better than their worst fears and had turned out quite nice and in the style that they liked. So I think some positives are definitely fair enough, can be taken. So, on to comparing with other vintages. And to do this, I compare with how I tasted other vintages at the same stage and then extrapolate forwards into how those vintages have turned out. So, in the whites, the first thing to say immediately is that they're better than 2016 and better than 2013. 2016, that other heavily frosted vintage, we had the effect of 2 generations of grapes. So you've got a sweet and sour flavor profile, the sweet being some slightly overripe first generation grapes and the sour being underripe second generation. I very rarely tasted that at all in the whites. Or 2013, when you had a vintage that hadn't quite ripened when it started to rot, and you got slightly shrill wines if you picked early and soft, and in some cases disastrous wines if you picked too late. There's a little element of that, particularly up in Chablis, but it's nothing like to the same degree. And I think the wines are mostly a lot cleaner in 2021. The acidity was high before malolactic. It can still be quite high, but the fruit itself tastes quite soft to me. So they're not going to make grand old wines as a result of that. But they are refreshing. There's a reasonable purity to most of them, and it's fairly obvious the small number that aren't. They typically have a clear reflection of the sites that they come from. They obviously don't rival the great years of which I would describe as 2014, 2017, and 2020, and nor are they like the warm, powerful years of 09, 15, and 19, where again the wines can be extremely good if you made the right picking decisions. So they could sort of be equivalent to 07 and 11. 2012, though I rather like 2012s, but they occasionally get a little bit of the electric feel of 2012 in some 21s. And 2018, which is a vintage which other people like less than I do, but it's a crop in which you don't get immense concentration, which is probably true of 21 as well. But it's a decent vintage, 2021. And if either you see in my or other people's notes wines which suggest the top end of the success rate, or you taste them next week or at another occasion and you like the wines, then there's no reason not to enjoy them and perhaps purchase them. There could be one reason not to purchase them, and I will come to that at the end. It's called price. Now about reds. I've already mentioned that I think the Côte Nuits have riper flavoured fruit on the whole. I do think the wines respect the hierarchy. This is probably true in both colours, in that a lot of the Bourgognes and lesser appellations were a bit on the scrawny side. Village wines, better than that. Premier Crus and Grand Crus equally also in the hierarchy really showed their ranking. So what vintages might we compare them with? Starting with youngest, some I asked the growers that regularly. Some said 2017 because the wines are a bit less concentrated than other recent vintages and they'll be ready early. I don't see any flavour profile similarity with 17. 16 comes to mind because of the frost, but the 16s are sort of chunky and powerful and sometimes a bit monolithic, and I don't see that. 14, there is a slight issue in that you had the effect of rot starting. That was the year of the Suzuki fruit fly. And there were definitely some wines in 2021, which I felt like 2014, were a bit shrill because people had panicked into picking a little bit early. It's not a major thing. It's not a huge number of wines, but it's slightly can be an issue. Then 07 or 11 got mentioned because they are wines that went through a growing season, which was a bit wet and difficult through the summer, but they were much earlier start to the cycle. They didn't get frosted, early start to the cycle, and very early picking dates. So I don't really find parallels, apart from the fact that 7 and 11s are both a tiny bit fragile. Nobody, bar one person, mentioned 2010, but I mentioned it to them because somebody had shown me some statistics which show that actually in terms of temperature over the 3 key summer months and in terms of rainfall over the 3 key summer months, 2021, the only other vintage that equates in both of those is 2010, which is interesting. And 2010 also we didn't think was a terrific vintage at harvest time, and it was only a year later when it showed better, and it's gone on getting better and better. And I think the most successful wines will have something in common with 2010, but there won't be many of them. The success rate will not be as equal. And some growers mentioned 2001, but I think 2001's, it's not a vintage that I found at the time I really understood, but the wines are probably a little bit more powerful, a little bit sturdier than most 21s. And I'll just also mention 2004, the year of the green meanies. Now, I don't think we'll have that much in the way of pyrazines, which was what caused the green meanies, which are those very sort of grilled green hazelnut flavors in the wine, which could be very ugly. Not everybody was affected by them, but they could be very ugly. But I will say that there are an awful lot of wines in 21 in the reds where I mentioned that there is a peppery aspect to them, not quite the same as the white pepper you get when people use stems, and some slightly vegetal notes, slightly green tannins. And that could be a worry, but I don't think it's going to go down the 2004 route. But when you've got a choice, then peppery is fine if you like fresher style of wines. If red Loires are amongst your favorites, then I wouldn't worry about pepper. If you see the word vegetable in a note, you might steer clear. There are a couple of other things. If you see sweaty or wilder flavors in a note, except occasionally I use it for Maurice Anthony, the wildness, and it's all right. But otherwise, it could mean I sniffed something which just might be bacterial, but it wasn't clear cut. So there are one or two reading between the lines where you might want to avoid the wines. But we're definitely, and especially in the Côte de Beaune, going for a fresher, pepperier style of wine in 2021. Now, I think that covers most of what I want to say. I just have one question saying, two questions now. One about Chablis. Can we focus on that a little bit more? In terms of the best ones, there, I think, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you that you will need to pick up my tasting reports off my website in order to get the detail of exactly which wine, which producer. And I'm afraid you have to pay money for that. Or indeed, a lot of wine merchants, with my permission, will pick up on my notes and on other critics' tasting notes as well. And John has asked, when will we get to see the Côte de Nuit tasting report, please? Well, I was hoping for Friday. I think I'm going to be stuck on it over most of the weekend, definitely by Sunday. And what I might do is divide it into two halves. I've virtually put to bed Marcenay, Gevrey, Maurice Anthony, Chambon-Muze, and Vougeot, so I could get those out for Friday. And it may be that Vosne Romanée and Nuit Saint-Georges will follow sort of midnight on Sunday, something like that. I did take Christmas Day off, and I did take my birthday on the 27th off. But apart from that, ever since I finished tasting on the 10th of December, it's been absolutely flat out doing the notes. So the last thing we've got to touch on is price, because I was going to say, you know, what might one's buying program be? There are plenty of nice wines, some very good wines. I've been sparing in my 5-star rating, a lot of 4-star wines. So there will be plenty that you could say, okay, this is a style of wine which I really like. And in all the commentaries you've seen about this vintage, it divides between the people who've taken the slightly negative view of it being a slightly fragile vintage, and those who are saying, but it's wonderful because these are the wines that we used to love and it's classic, etc., etc. But the thing is, the classic vintages were a lot less expensive than the 2021s will be. So where we are at the moment from the just 2 or 3 merchants whose prices that I've seen, is that the generic wines and the lesser village wines, and many village wines, even the lesser Premier Crus to some extent, have gone up a bit, maybe not much over 2020. What people tried to do, the growers, is they tried to fix their price, which did clearly go up in 2020. They tried to fix those prices to cope with the low volumes in 2021, which they knew were going to exist. Already they had in their cellars very low quantities. So they tried to fix a price that will work over 2 years. Since then, they've been hit with a number of double whammies, huge increases in fuel costs, this cost, that cost, transport costs, and so on and so forth, raw material costs, bottles not arriving. And so I understand that a few people, quite a few of those, have gone up by a small amount. And I'm not sure, depends which country you're in, is where your exchange rate is. So at the lower end, the price rises will be fairly limited, and maybe your kind, friendly importer will have kept them to 0. As you go further up the scale, so the prices become more visible. And once you get to top Premier Crus and Grand Crus, some people have gone absolutely crazy. And even the growers themselves, not even the secondary market, have even doubled a few prices. You think it's the same price as last year, but you then see you're only going to get 3 bottles in your case instead of 6. This is a problem. I can't see how this vintage can justify that. I think it could be a start of a tipping point. Burgundy is going to have to be really careful. Our friend Jeannie Cho Lee gave an address to the Académie Internationale du Vin when we met for our autumn meeting. And her topic was research she'd done on the Chinese market to see what drove collectors in which directions, what they wanted to drink, and what their view was on pricing, etc., etc. And there was bad will still towards Bordeaux because of them putting their prices up too much in 2009 and 10. And there was goodwill still towards Burgundy because there's still a complete buzz for Burgundy, and people felt that they were really enjoying the wines which they had paid a lot of money for. And there wasn't a feeling that it was the producers themselves who were pricing Burgundy out of a lot of people's price range. It's been the secondary market that's driven that up to now. But if Burgundians start charging those prices themselves from scratch, and you can see the temptation, because you put all the effort you want in to, all the effort you should put in to making really great wine, and then you've charged a similar price to before, only a little bit up, and you see it changing hands 2 days later at a totally different price, then you're understandably upset. It may be that you haven't appreciated that only a small percentage is changing hands at these crazy prices, but that has been a factor in some Burgundians changing their prices now. But it's dangerous, and I think we need all of us to fight back against it. I'm trying to do it when I talk to producers. I'm trying to do it when I talk to my rich collector friends around the world, saying, just be careful, because if we break this model, it could stay broken for a generation. So it's worrying. The sweet spot for what you might want to purchase then, I think, comes in the good village and the non-sexy Premier Cruise, where the quality is there for most people in this vintage, and the price isn't that much different from what we've seen before. But it's up to you. It depends on your disposable income. But when you see really high prices, which is not true of everybody, but some people, really high prices for their top wines, then it's maybe hard to justify. So I've managed to do almost accidentally the AJP Taylor thing, which when he gave his history lectures at university, he would think of his first sentence and he'd think of his last sentence and he'd speak for exactly an hour. I've done 58 minutes so far, and I don't want to go much beyond the hour. But if we have any final questions, then please put them on the questionnaire and answer, or on the chat, or indeed any reflections on what you've heard tonight, or you've already thought about things, then that would be great. Otherwise, I may bump into some of you. I shall be in London next week, so a few will be there. But those of you who have dialed in from Norway and North America and all sorts of other countries, then maybe not. Prague, Quebec, scrolling back through. Lovely. Well, I didn't wish you a Happy New Year when we started, which I ought to have done, so I apologize for that. But otherwise, if we have no more questions, and it doesn't look as though we do, I would like to thank you all for attending. Do please, if you haven't already done so, and you would like to, sign up for my website, www.insideburgundy.com. As you've heard, most of the reports are out, and the rest will follow very shortly, and there'll be loads more stuff coming up next year. So now, 1 hour after I started, I shall say thank you and goodbye, and I hope that you'll all get back onto drinking wine, if you're being dry at the moment, very, very soon. So thanks a lot, and see you next time. Bye-bye.